Yes, welcome for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation. How many heard the talk yesterday that I gave? Okay, so it's a good thing it's not the same. Well, there are some conceptual overlaps, but I think that I've tried to avoid any repetition. So what I'm basically going to try and talk a bit about is what actually happens when we put educational games into the classroom. What are the kind of barriers and problems that we experience, and how do students and teachers experience it? And I touched a bit on it yesterday, but I'm going to go more into depth with it today. For those one that didn't see, I have a mixed background, and Surge Games have been developing a number of different titles, where the Global Conflict series are the most well-known, but we also do what you call bread and butter work to kind of make a living. And I'm going to focus more. Yesterday I talked more on the Latin America game, and today I'm going to use Palestine as an example. So you can say that this talk is going to be more looking back, where the talk yesterday was more looking forward. And how was Palestine received, and what happened when you put it in a classroom context. It's been very well received by critics and the press and teachers, etc. But there presents themselves a number of problems when you actually put them into to the context. Before kind of digging into kind of these problems, it might be just very quickly stating that there's a number of different ways of using educational games, and I also touched upon this yesterday. And if you look kind of back over the last 40 years of research, there's been a number of different, you can say, trends and areas where you've been doing this research, and these are some of the most important ones. When educational games starts out, the use of them is very much from kind of instructional technology perspective, where you kind of basically have educational software, and then you try to put in a bit of scoring, high scoring reward system that's a bit more interesting and game-like. Then the next trend that really kind of starts up is what I call the cognitive and audiovisual challenges, which is a kind of a trend that focuses very much on can we use games to train and improve eye-hand coordination, problem solving, depth perception, and stuff like that. The next trend that has also and remains very strong is the focus on using games, especially for math and science, like algebra and simple math things that there's a lot of research into. Then there is a very big area of trying to use educational adventure games, which is kind of the tradition that we probably arises out of, because adventure games are fairly cheap to make. They're fairly easy to understand for people that don't play games necessarily themselves. They have a lot of advantages compared to other game formats. Another trend that was extremely strong, and it's getting even stronger in the US, is the kind of using games for health, and looking at how can it, for example, help people take their asthma medicine, or avoid being hit by insulin shock when they have some of these illnesses. And then the most recent one, which is the constructionism, which is this inspired by Parpet, where you try to have a more active approach to learning and knowledge, and where they kind of see games as kind of the paradise of constructionism, because you are active with an artifact and you do stuff with it and you discuss with it and you kind of interact with it and you do stuff. And then you have the social cultural approach, which is very much about what goes on around the game and how does students interact and what do they do with the game, how do they discuss it, rather than what actually goes on in the game. And the final one you can say is the kind of media education and computer games, which is also growing the last couple of years, where you actually look at games, what is the language, how do they compare to other genres, etc. And all of these trends have different, you can say, focus points and strengths and weaknesses. And as I said, I'm going to mostly extend from what you can say is kind of the educational adventure game, and then the social cultural and the constructionism approach. When you actually try to introduce, especially commercial games, but also games in general into the classroom, and probably excluding kind of making games, you can say. Then there is a lot of kind of challenges that you run into, and the more you can say, the more it is a commercial game, the more aggravated these problems get. And the first thing that you kind of run into is that most games are actually not really designed for the structures that we have in classrooms. They're not designed for the way that we put up computer labs. They're not designed for the space constraints that we have. They're not designed for the time constraint, splitting stuff into lessons and starting up like that. Students' expectation, if you uncritical introduce games in a classroom, will be very, very optimistic and something different than that you might want them to. They're playing and they're having fun, and you have to kind of make sure that they also understand that this is kind of an educational experience. And then obviously you have all the technical issues that are also pretty scary. Then when you actually go into when you talk to teachers that use games, and when you try to set up these experiments, and you talk to teachers afterwards about what was really the hard part, then most of them actually underestimate the preparation phase. The fact that they need to develop specific material, installing, learning how the game works, and combining their teaching in new ways is much more time consuming and much more radical than most teachers anticipate. The next thing that a lot of teachers kind of run into as a problem is that, especially commercial games, but also a lot of educational games, don't really have a very good learning curve or a very good tutorial. They tend to kind of aggravate the competence gaps that exist between students already. So when you look at a class that uses games, you will very often have the good gamers and the not so good gamers, and the good academics and the not so good academics. And what will happen is very often that the good academics and good gamers will really dig into this and really run with it, and the weak students will kind of shy a bit away from it and prioritize. So when you start out, you have already a pretty big challenge between people that play games and people that don't play games, and this is aggravated through the course, making it very difficult for the teacher to actually kind of put things together. And you need to be very careful when you kind of put students together and you plan the course that this works out, and you don't lose students. And some of the studies that I've done, it's almost up to 25% of the student that you actually risk losing, because they kind of this is too much, and they're so good at it, and so if you don't combine the groups in the good way, then you get into problems. Then another thing that's very often missing is that you very often tend to think about educational games, and when you use commercial games in an educational setting, as kind of the games themselves. So you kind of forget what's going on around the games and how do you support the activities around the games. So you lack what you can call